Hello once again from the Prim Reaper. Welcome to the next video in my Misuse of Words series. The word I'll be going over in this pair of videos is phobia. Now, this is a little bit different than racism, as you can imagine, because phobia as a suffix can be attached to a great number of things which completely changes its meaning. The interesting thing about that is then the fact that the word phobia can be misused in totally different ways depending on its prefix. So in all actuality, these two videos will be covering the misuse of several different words. To begin with, let's look at the actual definition for the word phobia. A persistent, irrational fear of a specific object, activity, or situation that leads to a compelling desire to avoid it. Okay, so you'll notice that the definition refers to an irrational fear. Not dislike, not hatred, fear. I'm sure you guys can think of a lot of phobias, but I think the quintessential phobia is arachnophobia, or fear of spiders. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I can definitely speak to the physical symptoms of what a phobia feels like in the context of spiders. Luckily for me, living in Canada reduces the size of spiders that I have to encounter on a regular basis, but I found an inch-long one in my bathtub once, and I unleashed one of the longest streams of obscenities that I can recall. I don't even have the benefit of being able to ask my husband to squish it for me, because he's the same way. We found a spider in our bedroom once, and we were both so freaked out that we had to move to the spare room to calm down and sleep. It's funny in hindsight, but goddamn, the adrenaline was real in that moment. Now, this kind of irrationality can arise in response to a lot of different things. Needles, public spaces or speaking, insects, animals. Actually, a brief fact that you guys might find interesting is that most phobias, in the real sense of the word, have similar physiological symptoms. Strong anxiety, activation of the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight in layman's terms, and panic attacks. But blood injection injury phobias have a unique set of symptoms involving an increase in blood pressure and heart rate, followed by a sudden drop in both, which can result in dizziness, nausea, and fainting. Interestingly, the reason for this is suspected to be evolutionary in nature, as by fainting, the person being attacked or injured might inhibit further attack, and the drop in blood pressure would minimize blood loss. But this is just me going on a biopsych nerd tangent, so I'll get back to business. Now, I don't want to come across like a total pedant here. If you look up the word phobic, you encounter having an intolerance or aversion for, along with the original definition of phobia. Naturally, that original definition still stands in a lot of cases, like agoraphobia, arachnophobia, or claustrophobia. But when people use the word Islamophobic, xenophobic, homophobic, or transphobic, they're rarely, if ever, referring to an irrational fear anymore. Instead, these words, which I would probably argue are the most common uses of the suffix phobia in the authoritarian left, refer instead to the notion that people who hold those labels feel hatred or intolerance towards the prefix. As I established with the word phobic, I wouldn't necessarily say that this switch is a misuse or that it's even inaccurate. But I would say that, even in this sense, a lot of the time, like many other misused words, these are being handed out far more often than they're called for. So, because it follows from my previous video, I'll begin with Islamophobia as an example. You'll recall back to M103, the specific reference to Islamophobia and the need to condemn it. The problem is, the motion doesn't really take any measures to define what that word really means. We can make a guess based on the dictionary definition, hatred or fear of Muslims or of their politics or culture. But what does this look like in practice? Certainly we can assume that hate crimes and violence against someone based on the fact that they're Muslim would be included, and rightly so, I'd say. Similarly, the assumption that all Muslims are radical terrorists, I would also say qualifies as an irrational fear. But exactly how far down does the concept of Islamophobia or even simply discrimination go? Is a cartoonist drawing images of the Prophet Muhammad, critical or otherwise, an example of discrimination against Muslims? Is making a Muslim cashier handle pork or alcohol products an example of discrimination? Is requiring someone to remove a face veil to go into a bank an example of Islamophobia? I'm sure a lot of people would argue that no, it obviously isn't, but there are plenty of people who would try to argue the opposite, and this is part of the issue. If we don't clearly delineate what constitutes Islamophobia, what constitutes religious discrimination, all of a sudden you might get more and more people asking for special treatment or exemptions because if you don't give me those exemptions, then that's against my religion and therefore Islamophobic. And after all, you know how we feel about Islamophobia. But let's leave that concept alone. After all, there's a reason they call the slippery slope a fallacy. I don't mean to suggest that something like this definitely will happen. I just want to paint a picture of why emotion based on a concept like this is a flawed one. I want to touch on something else. As I've mentioned already, there are legitimate examples of irrational fear and intolerance of Muslims, without question. And of course, there is never any excuse for behaving in a hateful manner towards anyone based on their beliefs. But at the same time, is it not also true that there are some beliefs and behaviors prevalent in Islamic cultures that are perfectly rational to fear, and to certain extents to be intolerant of? Countries in the Middle East are often quite well known for being lacking in human rights. A lot of people tend to focus on women's rights in these areas, but let me assure you, it's rarely a picnic for men either. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of what some of these human rights violations look like, but I'll list a few examples. Many of these countries have constitutional declarations claiming to protect freedom of religion, but in many cases this is limited, and apostasy from Islam nevertheless often carries significant punishments, up to and including the death penalty. Speaking of the death penalty, these countries often impose such punishment for crimes that we in the West would generally consider comparatively minimal, such as adultery, robbery, and even drug use in some cases. These methods of execution are usually not quick and painless, but rather the opposite, going against international conventions against cruelty and punishments. Most of these countries are generally unsupportive of LGBT rights, to say the least. While several of these countries only impose strong penalties or life in prison for homosexuality, the dark red countries have been known to dole out the death penalty. You might even go so far as to call them homophobic. Women in many Islamic countries are forced to wear restrictive clothing in various degrees to avoid tempting the men around them. You may be familiar with this image. This is a women's protest against the hijab in Iran in 1979. A lot of these countries were much more free and open just a few short decades ago, and now many of them place restrictions on what women are and aren't allowed to wear. These restrictions come with punishments for disobeying, so it's not as though they're simply choosing to dress modestly. Many Muslims living in countries that are not predominantly Islamic believe that Shari'ah law should be imposed in those countries, some even going as far as to state that they prefer to live by Shari'ah law instead of the laws of the country. I strongly encourage you to check out the link I'll be posting below titled Muslim Statistics, as it provides several examples of this, including percentages on people who believe as such. Now, these few examples that I listed generally tend to occur in countries where Islam is the dominant religion, and though certainly not every individual living in these cultures supports these codes of conduct, they are nevertheless prevalent and supported by a lot of people in power and average citizens alike. You ask the average person living in a Western culture if they would rather their lifestyle become more like these countries, and 9.9 times out of 10, I'm pretty sure we could wager a guess at what they'd say. So, given our overall conception of phobia as an irrational fear, intolerance, or dislike, and given Islamophobia as a hatred or intolerance of Muslims, I'd therefore like to posit a few questions. Is it irrational for a gay man to be afraid of an ideology, and I want to point out here that I'm referring to the ideology, not to specific Muslims, that treats something he had no control over and that hurts no one else as though it's an offense sufficiently punishable by death? Is it particularly hateful for a woman to feel distaste at the prospect of being made to cover up against her own desires by an ideology? Is it intolerant for someone to believe that the prospect of a rape victim being punished for being raped is a horrible one? I could go on, but I think you get the point. I don't think that it's unreasonable, irrational, or even particularly hateful or intolerant for people from more liberal Western societies to find many of these concepts hateful and intolerant in their own right. Let's use Christian persecution of homosexuals as an example. Most people are pretty well against this sort of thing at this point, and are quick to call out Christian bigotry in this right. Look at all the shit that Pence caught for his views if you need a face to pair with this. Nobody calls this reaction Christianophobic or anything similar to that, because I think at this point everyone just kind of acknowledges that this is an outdated viewpoint that has no place in an egalitarian secular society. But for some reason, a lot of people seem to be giving the ideology of Islam a free pass. I, on the other hand, don't think it's irrational or intolerant at all to want to challenge some of these viewpoints, even if just to make sure that when accepting newcomers into our society, we don't import a different sort of intolerance. It's not unreasonable for people to be a little uncomfortable that certain practices are becoming more common in the West that have long since been considered inappropriate. Again, the use of the word Islamophobia has its place, but it doesn't lie in simply challenging the tenets of Islam. We have to make sure that this distinction is made very clear so that we don't start confusing protection of people with protection of ideologies. I'm going to briefly address the concept of xenophobia now before I end this video, and I'll save homophobia and transphobia for the next part. I was going to try to fit them all in the same video, but I didn't realize just how far down the transphobia rabbit hole went. Before I get into this concept, however, let's lighten the mood with a little bit of thematically appropriate music. Ah, that's better. So the common definition of xenophobia is fear or hatred of foreigners, people from different countries, or strangers. It's pretty easy to picture a person who thinks their culture is the best and that everyone else is inferior. One of the first images I get in my mind when I picture this is a woman I saw while on vacation in Mexico screaming at a receptionist for having the audacity to not have American change for her American cash. It was a pretty uncomfortable experience. When I picture a xenophobic person, I envision someone particularly self-centered, ignorant, and completely unwilling to accept that their homeland isn't the best place in the world to live. I think to a certain extent, we all have a little bit of personal bias towards the place where we grew up or the areas with which we're most familiar, but I think that when that bias pushes into the superiority aspect is when we start seeing problems. I haven't seen this one be misused nearly as much as the other three phobias I've mentioned, but the primary misuse that I do see is the idea that white people are completely xenophobic for the idea of just maybe wanting to preserve their culture. I hate to linger on this topic, and I promise that this is the last video for a long while that I'll be bringing it up, but a lot of this seems to be coming from the mass migration that Europe is seeing right now. Many people are afraid that a lot of these countries are losing crucial elements of their cultures, and many others are calling these fearful people xenophobic for daring to want to preserve what made their countries special. The thing is, I don't think that a large portion of these people are intolerant or hateful of other cultures at all. It's not incongruent to want to respect other cultures, but also to desire to preserve your own. But unfortunately, it seems that any time a white person talks about this, they become xenophobic. It's actually humorous when you consider this in tandem with the concept of cultural appropriation that so often gets thrown out these days. Because not only is it a horrible thing for white people to want to utilize any elements of other cultures, but it's also terrible for white people to want to preserve their cultures. Hell, some people are going as far as to argue that white people have no culture, so it seems like white people are in some kind of weird culture limbo where they simultaneously hate other cultures but have none of their own, and therefore can't resist the urge to use elements from said other cultures that they hate. Damn, I'm confused right now. This social justice shit is hard to keep track of. Anyway, it's a little strange that this concept is so often levied at white cultures when one of the most well-known xenophobic cultures is actually Asian. Japan is one of the most homogenous first world countries, and is comparably intolerant of ethnic minorities. When many first world countries were eager to accept Syrian refugees, Japan joined in the efforts by helping a whopping 150 of them. And I'm not even kidding you, the first line in this article goes as follows: "A Japanese program aimed at accepting a small number of refugees from war-torn Syria is under fire for implying that pregnant women are not welcome." Damn. And yet somehow Japan doesn't seem to be facing nearly as much flack for this as majority white cultures. There's a pretty obvious imbalance there, and it seems to be flowing from the increasingly poisonous social justice groups and universities saying that white people can do no right. And again, it seems sad that I should have to clarify this, but I certainly don't think that white cultures are the pinnacle of human existence, nor that I think that other cultures are inherently inferior. But I also don't think that it's fair for everyone else to have a reasonable stake in wanting to preserve their cultures, but the moment white people desire to do so, it's viewed as racist and xenophobic. It's obviously unequal and unfair, and the notion should be challenged whenever it comes up. Anyway, I think that's going to mark the end of this video. I can't guarantee which video will be coming out next, as I have so many ideas that I've wanted to talk about and concepts on the back burner that I might bring forward just as a brief change of pace. But rest assured that I'll be working on the video about homophobia and transphobia in tandem with these other videos. Either way, I'll try to have something out sometime next week. So thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.